We had some issues with our live stream on Sunday that I didn't catch until too late to fix, but it should all be fine tonight and working properly, hopefully. And so all you missed Sunday, if you weren't able to be in the introductory study, really, truthfully, all we did was went through a history getting us up to the book of Numbers. And so if you want to know what we did Sunday, go to Exodus 1 and read the book. And if you do that, you'll know what we did primarily in our time together, although obviously we did it in a faster fashion than you might be able to read all of that book. But that's basically what we did. We caught up historically so that we kind of set the stage for this discussion that we're having about the book of Numbers. And so we're going to get into the study itself in a little more detail tonight. But before we get into that discussion, let's go to God in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you again for this beautiful day you've provided, this wonderful opportunity that we have to come together to share in a study of your word, to appreciate this Old Testament history and the lessons that we can learn, how you prepared your people for a promised land, and how those parallel the ways that you help us and lead us to your eternal home in heaven. Give us a heart that's receptive to the lessons we can learn and to appreciate this wonderful history of your people. Thank you for loving us and bringing Christ through this heritage, and it's through His name that we pray. Amen. So, I'll give you the fast version of the book of Exodus. They led by Moses, they're led out of Egyptian bondage, right? And they come in towards the promised land. They're not there yet. They travel through various circumstances and situations. They cross the Red Sea. They have that moment where God parts the Red Sea and allows for them to guide on across. We talked a little bit Sunday about how they did not traverse straight into the heart of the area because they would have to go against people that were more prepared to battle than they were at that stage. Because of the length of time they had been enslaved, they weren't ready for that kind of effort and purpose at that stage. They ultimately end up at what mountain? At Mount Sinai, right? And what do they receive there? They receive the law, right? They receive the law and receive it really twice, right? The first time to Moses destroys those tablets because what he finds, because he was gone in their minds too long, and so you have that challenge. But you find yourself there at Sinai ultimately. At the end of the book of Exodus, God gives Moses the instructions for what central place of worship? The tabernacle, right? So he gives them all of the details of how this tabernacle is going to be constructed, what they're going to make it out of, what they're going to provide for it, how all of those things are going to be provisioned. And we even talked a little bit about the fact that in Exodus 38 and verse 26 of that, I didn't give you the verse, by the way, on Sunday, but in verse 26 of Exodus 38, there was a census then of the men 20 years and older in order to develop a tax in order to be able to continue to maintain the tabernacle after it had been constructed. Various tribes and groups and families had been bringing provisions that God needed to make the tabernacle, and they'd been working on that. At the beginning of the second year, so in the first month of the year, of their second year. Everything, by the way, from the time that they leave Egypt and get to Sinai and get to the building of the tabernacle, that is the length of a year. It's 1 year time period. In order for all of those things you can think about that happened in that time period, it's 1 year. And then in the first month of the second year after they've left Egypt, God tells them that they need to construct the tabernacle and make sure it gets organized and purposed in the right way. This numbering we're studying here in the book of Numbers, when did it happen? Go back to chapter 1 real quick. I believe he tells us at the beginning. Okay, so say it one more time. Yeah, second month. First day, and I got my own computer all discombobulated here, so give me half a second. But in the first, say it one more time. First day, second month, second year. Okay, so we're 1 month later. Okay, so full year, up to, and then and then they build that tabernacle at the end of Exodus, okay? And he says, establish that in the first month of the first year, or not the first year, the first month of the coming year. This happens 1 month later. All right, so I'm just trying to get us to see, we're not talking about eons of time when all of these events occur. We're talking about really a short span of time for these events to occur. And the Lord speaks to Moses here in the wilderness of Sinai. That's where we're at, right? Mount Sinai area. In the tabernacle of the congregation on the first day of the second month of the second year. So just a year and 2 months in, or really a month in, and the first day of that second month, this numbering occurs. Now, we talked about the fact briefly on Sunday that there's a balance really in those numbers that you see in Exodus 38:26 and what you see happening here in the book of Numbers. They coincide with each other. One was about a tax. This numbering was about what? Yeah, army, right? This is about protecting the people and the tabernacle and those around it. So that was those 4 areas, right? North, south, east, and west, 3 tribes on each side. And we talked about that on Sunday morning. There's a chart in your outlines that show that picture as well. That's where we're at in our discussion. I gave you the 5-minute version of what I did in 30 minutes back on Sunday. So let's get back into this study and talk a little bit more in detail. So what were they supposed to pick out of those tribes as they begin this process of establishing these encampments? Leaders, right? You got to have somebody in charge, right? You've got to have somebody ultimately that you can go to and give instructions, and they'll pass it down. Now, I realize you're probably not going to be able to read that. That's more for my benefit than it is for your benefit up on the screen right now. But that's them, right? On the left-hand side of the screen, that's the 12 tribes. And on the other side, the right-hand side of the screen, those are the 12 men that were chosen in order to serve. Now, I put them on the screen, and I put them on my charts for myself because there's not a chance in the world I'll pronounce any of those correctly. So just trust the fact that God's instruction was fulfilled. That's the purpose I want us to make sure we understand. God says pick out, and he by the way, did what as it relates to them? Did Moses decide who got to be the leaders? No, God picked them. That's what I want you to recognize. God decided. He guides Moses through this process of making sure each tribe has a leader among them. It's interesting as well, and if you go back into your lesson sheets, I'll show it to you on the screen what I'm talking about. It's this graph right here. If I can get more of it on the screen, that'll be great. But I can't. There it is. So this is, right, we talked about this, but here's what's interesting. What was that, you may remember, what was that group encampment to the north called? I'm not tricking you here. There's actually text that teaches us about this. So look at the first name listed. If you're looking at that chart and you see Dan, you see Ephraim, you see Reuben, and you see Judah, right? Dan at the north, Ephraim to the west, Reuben to the south, Judah to the east. Those encampments were named after those 4 fellas, right? Those 4 tribes. So the encampments were known by the predominant name given in those particular regions. Dan, Ephraim, Reuben, and Judah. That's what those encampments became known by. And that's where they had a standard, a banner, if you will, of something signifying this is what encampment that you're in. And so the text would teach about how each of those encampments had a standard, a banner, an identification, what we would more likely call a flag, in order to identify which encampment you were dealing with. Now, we talked about Sunday. We're not talking about a couple of dozen guys out, in a pop-up trailer, right, fishing somewhere. What do we estimate? There's over 600. Yeah, there's over 600,000, and that's just the men 20 years and older, right? There's over 600,000 of them. So if you just add some women to that number, add some youth to that number, you can easily get to 2 million plus in relationship to how many people. And so they're going to be living in these camps around the tabernacle. Who's living in the center of that? That's the Levites, right? So the Levites are the ones that are going to be serving at the tabernacle and bearing the responsibilities of that. And so all the others are in protection of that center place, each of them with their own set of responsibilities as it relates to that. And then as they begin to traverse and move, they're going to have to move 2 million plus people. And these, yeah, a lot of room. And I want to plant this seed in your minds. A lot of room, but also a lot of people living in what? Close proximity to each other. Yeah, and that'll be significant before we get done this evening.
One added thing to that is they also had all their flocks and herds from which they would eat off of, plus the sacrifices.
Yeah. So yeah, you're not talking about just human beings involved in these camps. You've got all the livestock and everything else that they might have had with them as well. Okay, so each group has a leader, somebody that Moses or whomever at any particular time can go and have a conversation with, be responsible to take care of any direction or guidance that God might give. So let's start talking about this question of sanctification. So we're in chapter 5, by the way. We're fast forward. Nope, that's not what I want to do. My bad. I apologize. I tricked you. Or tricked myself for half a second. I can't get rid of anything on the screen tonight. I need to talk about the priesthood first. So the Levites and the organization of those priests came in different ways. So who were the sons of Aaron that are listed there in chapter 3? Okay. Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, if we're saying that right. Which two do you know? Nadab and Abihu. Why is that? Yeah, the strange fire that where's that record at? Leviticus 10. Well, how's that possible when Leviticus comes before Numbers in the Bible? That's right. It's not in chronological order, right? It doesn't necessarily, just because it happens there's the history of these events and circumstances are happening throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, right? Exodus kind of leads into Numbers, but Leviticus has got things that relate to the time periods throughout that narrative. And so that just be aware of that when you read certain things in the book of Leviticus, even though that book comes before Numbers in the canon, there are events in the book of Leviticus that happen pre the things we're reading about in the book of Numbers. So we know those two, though, because they're the ones that offered the strange fire, and what happened to them? They died. God took their lives for it. He had not commanded them to do that, and they died. So we kind of know them because of their failures, but Eleazar and Ithamar, they serve as specific roles in this early history, and we'll see that here in just a little bit when we talk about some of those particular groups and their responsibilities in relationship to the tabernacle. What was the work of the Levites described in verses 5 through 39? Okay, you could sum it up that way, can't you, Jim? Their job, in essence, is to take care of the tabernacle. That's the initial purposes that they have. They will ultimately serve as the priests of God moving forward in their history. But predominantly, they're going to be serving in the role of taking care of the tabernacle and its purposes and the sacrifices that people are going to have to bring to them And they'll be present there in serving the purposes of when people have to pay a vow or whatever it might be that they have to do. But they're all intents and purposes, they're there to do the things relating to the keeping of the tabernacle. Why did God, and again, by the way, this is how I'm going to go through most of this, these historical aspects and very quickly. But why did God take the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the children of Israel in chapters 3 to the end of, or the beginning of chapter 5? Or the end of chapter 3. What's that? Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. So that paragraph, or segment, it talks about how the firstborn belong to God. Why? Yeah. When that 10th plague came, the firstborn died unless they were where? Yeah, and inside a home with the blood over the doorpost, right? God spared the firstborn from the plague that He sent forth into Egypt and provided for them a means by which to be spared. And in essence, they owe their lives very literally to God. So He could have required that all of the firstborn serve Him in very specific ways as remediation for what He had provided in sparing them. But that would potentially cause a problem, right? What kind of problems could you imagine encountering if all the firstborn of all these families that are encamped all around the tabernacle are not available to them? What are you going to lack? Okay, you're going to lose out on some of the oldest of the eventually of the fighting men that might be available to you. What else? Those men are going to provide. Go ahead.
It'd just be easier to have a group than to grab one from each of the other for organizations.
Okay, fair, right? Right? It could become quite confusing if you're going to try to organize these men for particular service, but they're all coming from every family within different tribes in various ways. It makes a lot more sense. There's divine wisdom in just pick one tribe. And those folks will take care of the work that all of the firstborn should have been doing. So there's an interesting part of that segment talks about how what were the Levites supposed to do with all the things they brought out of Egypt? You may remember reading that. They'd give it all away, right? Because they were going to be taken care of. They're going to be taken care of by the other tribes. So they'd given all, and then they had to pay the people that had the firstborn. They had to pay remediation. They had to pay a tax, for lack of a better description, for all of those firstborn that should have been in direct service to God. But the Levites are going to take care of that for you now. So they were all instructed to make payment for each one of them in order that the Levites would have what they need to carry on the work and purposes that they have. It's a long list of detailed kinds of things, but that's the summary of it. God could have called all the firstborn to serve because of how He spared them as it relates to the death of the firstborn in Egypt. But rather than do that, He chooses the Levites as a tribe to itself in order to accomplish that. They're not going to be able to have the same way to sustain themselves as the other groups are because they're very specific to their work and purpose at the tabernacle. So because they divest themselves of those things, everybody else has to contribute to keep the Levites sustained. And even paying restitution to the Levites for every firstborn that didn't have to serve out of all the other tribes. That's the summary of what happened in chapter 3 as it relates to that function. Any questions or thoughts you might have had?
I think that had anything to do with the construction of the golden calf at Sinai when the Levites were the only ones that stood with Moses?
Yeah, and it very well could be why God selects them, and there's already a sanctity about them, and as it relates to it, I think that's fair. Any other thoughts? I want to show you something in chapter 3 real quick. So, look down at verse 45 for a minute. Numbers chapter 3, verse 45, if I can get there without... and I want you to I'm sorry, not 45, 43. So, when we got the count earlier from the men that were 20 years and upwards out of each of the tribes, there was some detail there, but most of those numbers fell in some kind of rounded fashion, did they not? But I want you to notice something about when they counted all these firstborn males. And all the firstborn males by the number of names from a month old and upward, of those that were numbered of them, were 22,203 score and 13. I found it curious that it's very exacting. This wasn't just kind of, a rounded estimate or even a rounded off number. This was very, very specific. As it relates to that. They knew exactly how many fit that description of the firstborn. And then the Lord tells Moses, verse 44 and 45, take the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the children of Israel, and the cattle of the Levites instead of their cattle, and the Levites shall be mine, I am the Lord. And there's what I was talking to you about earlier. So you're going to take the Levites and their possessions, their livestock, they're going to serve me in purpose. Though those things could have been taken right from every tribe, each of those tribes are going to be able to retain theirs, and then they're going to have to pay a tax to the Levites in order to receive that. Notice verse 46. For those that are to be redeemed of the 203 score and 13 of the firstborn of Israel, which are more than the Levites, thou shalt even take 5 shekels apiece by the poll. After the shekel of the sanctuary shalt thou take them. The shekel is 20 gerahs. And thou shalt give the money wherewith the odd number of them is to be redeemed unto Aaron and to his sons. And Moses took the redemption money of them that were over and above them that were redeemed by the Levites. And so, again, just trying to get this picture in your mind. The Levites are making a sacrifice, in a sense, to be the ones who serve at the tabernacle. They don't get the same benefits that the other tribes have. They don't get to keep certain belongings like the others did. They don't have a place to put cattle and things like the others did. And so in return, the others will take care of them by paying that poll tax that we also saw in Exodus 38 and verse 26, in order to make sure that the Levites have what they need and Aaron and his sons have what they need to sustain themselves through this process. Establishment. You can read more about that in the book of Leviticus, right? Because that's the book dedicated to the Levites. And you can learn more and more about all of these various facets when you look at that. But Numbers gives us a very general idea of what's going on there in that text. So there were basically 3 main groups then that he identifies in the narrative. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 4, Moses tells Aaron, gather up some of the sons of Kohath from among the sons of Levi after their families by the house of their fathers. Now here's a slight variation though. How old were these fellas going to be? Yeah, 30. We've been counting 20 and up. Then we count firstborn. Now we're counting 30 and up when it comes to these three particular families among the Levites that are going to serve some very specific purposes. 30 years old and upward, even until 50 years. So not 20 and up, but a 20-year span. From 30 to 50, let's number them. And they're going to be assigned to do the work of the tabernacle. So from verses 1 through 20 of chapter 4, he talks about these family of Kohath, the Kohathites. And what was their responsibility?
They carried the ark.
Okay, they carried the ark. What else were they responsible for?
They cared for all the utensils and things.
Yeah, all of those holy items, right? All of those most holy utensils and tools and purposes, they were the ones that had to make sure they came in and brought the staves in and put through the ark to make sure it could be moved in the proper way. They were responsible for all the very peculiar and sanctified items that were used in the tabernacle for the purposes of God. It's interesting because there's even some warnings in the narrative about how the curiosity seeker may want to be careful, right? Any of you guys nibby? Be careful. I don't want you to raise your hand. I just want you to think about it. You ever just kind of peer over somebody's shoulder or kind of always want to look around the corner, see what's happened and want to know? You do it around the Kohathites and you'll find yourself dead. And God says, I don't want anybody going in there just checking it out. I'm giving some responsibilities for them when it's time to move, and they've got to use badger skins, and they've got to use blue cloth, and they've got to do all these various things in certain ways and certain coverings. They have to do all these very specific things, and he tells them, listen, nobody else in there. No onlookers to figure out or see or just want to be around when they do that. Pretty stern warning that he gives as it relates to that. And so that became their very specific work, to organize those items and prepare them for travel when need be. And that's what those Kohathites did. What did Gershon do? Anybody write down what the Gershons did? Curtains, right? So all the coverings over all, so all the curtains that were there, whether it was covering up a certain area, whether it was over across a door, whatever it might be, they were responsible for all those. Now keep in mind, we're not talking about a 3x5 sheer that you got hanging over your blinds at home. These were several cubits large as it relates to these curtains that were used. And so this would have been a very physically demanding task in order to prepare these curtains for travel and to make sure that they would be ready to be moved anytime the camp moved and anytime the tabernacle obviously would have to move with it. And so they were given that responsibility. By the way, let me back you up for a second. Which of the sons of Aaron was in charge of those Kohathites? Anybody happen to notice that? Of the Kohathites. Yeah, that's Eleazar, okay? Eleazar's in charge of the Kohathites, and he has to oversee those responsibilities. The Gershons were overseen by Ithamar, if you go back and look. So he's going to oversee the Gershons. In fact, I'll give you a quick fast forward. He's also in charge of the third group, which is Merari, right? Yeah, I'll let you guys say it, and I'll take your word for it. Right? So what do those guys do? That third group, the Merarians. Their structure, right? Those are the guys that were in charge of the basic structure of the tabernacle, to make sure any pole that was used to hold it, any boards that were used to keep things together. They were the structural guys. Ithamar was responsible for facilities, right? He's overseeing the Gershons, he's overseeing the Merari, those guys, and he's overseeing curtains and walls and poles and stakes and rope, and right, he's structural. Eleazar's overseeing the Kohathites. They are the guys taking care of the spiritual things, that are the worship things, the things that were part of that inner part of the tabernacle that were used for the very holiest of purposes that God had. Who don't you see? Nadab and Abihu. Interesting. You don't see Nadab and Abihu given any responsibility here. Are they still alive? Not to trick your chronology here. Happened in Leviticus chapter 10, we got to get the tabernacle going before they could die, right? And so I would argue, I would believe that they're still alive. Somebody can come back and challenge my chronology later. I'm not great at that kind of thing, but they're not noted as it relates to these matters. Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to construct, not just construct it, but then it had to be able to be deconstructed by these men, packed up exactly as God told them to pack it up, and moved wherever they were going, and at whatever time. Lots of things happening among these men. Question 7 in your question sheets asked, then give the results of the census of the Levites. Remember, they weren't noted earlier because all we counted was those fighting men that were going to encamp around the tabernacle. Now we get a census of the Levites based on these three groups, the Kohathites, the Gershons, and the Meraris. The Kohathites had how many? I had in my notes 2630, but maybe I misread it somewhere. I can go back and look. Kohathites. How did I get 2630? My typing must be terrible. So I'll go back and look. Okay. The Kohathites, number of the sons of Kohathites, verse 4, from 30 years old and upward and 50 years, everyone that entereth the tabernacle, and those that were numbered of them by their families were 2,750. Thank you. Those were the numbers of the sons of Gershon, verse 38, throughout their families and by the house of their fathers, from 30 years old and upward. Even those that were numbered throughout their families by the house of their fathers were 2,630. That's where I got that number from. I've got a new number down here that I'm not even sure where it came from. And then that's Gershon, correct? Then Merari were 3,200, 3,200, correct? I know where my last number came from now. I skipped one and totaled them up. What's the total of those? 8580. Yeah, that's what I did. I skipped the first number and attributed 8580 to the Merari's rise instead of seeing that as a total number. I was never any good at math. But anyway, so again, we're numbering who though? With these groups, because that seems low, right? 8580. I mean, we've got some groups that are in the 60,000. But that was 20-year-olds and upward. These numbers are strictly 30 to 50. That's it, 30 to 50. So that's why these census numbers of the Levites are far lower than the others, because we're not counting the exact same group of people. The reason for that is their service, number one, they're not paying the poll tax because they're receiving it, right? You'll never find a government, by the way, that will pay its own taxes to itself, okay? In fact, you can find places around the Federal Hill up there where they don't pay any tax to anybody, right? So the Levites are receiving it, so that this number isn't about that. They're not in the encampments around protecting because they're doing the work at the tabernacle. So that numbering is not about that. This is just to identify how many each family had that could contribute to this purpose that God had assigned through Moses to each of them to take care of the tabernacle. But again, though, the tabernacle is large, and yet that's a lot of hands. 8,580 men to help take care of these responsibilities that relate to caring for and taking care of and moving at times the tabernacle. Questions or thoughts about any of that? Again, I didn't read a lot about those particular. We're just trying to get an understanding here of the numbers that we're dealing with and the general purposes that God gave to each. All right, so we've got a few minutes left. I want to jump to chapter 5. We won't get far, but I want to at least get this conversation going, and then Lord willing, we can talk more about it on Sunday. Because here's where I think we can start seeing some parallels. And I'll do this a little bit with you tonight in the last few minutes, but it's kind of good in some ways that I've just got a couple minutes so I'll introduce the concept to you, and then you can go home between now and Sunday and do the same thing. What I'd like for you to do is when you go through these various types of sanctification that the book of Numbers describes, I want you to think, well, is there anything in the New Testament that parallels to that? Is there anything, and we know sanctification is parallel in the New Testament, right? We know that. The New Testament talks about being sanctified just as importantly as they're talking about here. So I want you to, and I'll illustrate to you what I mean by that before we're done, but I want you to think about that. Spend a little bit of time in your own study looking at, well, what would you parallel that to? What could I look at in the New Testament and say, that looks similar to what he's asking of these various groups in the book of Numbers. So the very first thing means by which to sanctify is what we might simply call, if you're looking in your outlines, as a cleansing or a separation, right? We mentioned earlier that though they might have a large enough area to make it work, they're living in very densely populated tent cities, right? How quickly could disease spread? Rapidly, right? Rapidly. And I want you to, and I think that's important because if you just read these on the surface, you're like, man, that sounds harsh, right? You know, here's a sick guy, get out, right? If you think of it that way, you might think, well, that sounds awful harsh. But if they didn't want to wipe them all out with one bad moment of disease, their only means by which to protect the whole was to sanctify the camps by keeping anybody that had a leprosy or some kind of other unclean disease that was going to potentially harm everybody in the camp. The instructions were to send them on and to put them outside of the camp. And it's the only way to protect, as we said, the densely populated tent cities that they were living in. That desire to sanctify, to separate, is that a New Testament principle as well? Can you think of any areas in which that you might see that in the New Testament? I'll give you a quick example since our bell has rung. Look at what Jesus said in John 17. In John 17, he said, let me back you up a little bit on the screen. Verse 15, I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil. They were trying to sanctify them physically from disease and illness and sickness, Jesus is trying to sanctify people from evil, from sin. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world, separated from it. How did they get there? Verse 17. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. Sanctification. In the days of Numbers, it was about keeping the people healthy, their physical lives clean. Jesus talked about sanctification in the purpose of keeping the soul, the spirit, the inner man clean, separated from evil. And the means by which he does that separates them with truth. So we're going to see some of those kinds of parallels, I think, throughout all of these. And so be looking for that. Spend a few minutes. I know it's not a question on the outline sheets, but I think you'll find it valuable. I know I did, and I worked a little bit ahead. But just spend some time. Think about, okay, does that sound familiar? Is there something I've read in the New Testament that kind of matches up to? Just be thinking that way and see whether or not you can find the parallels between the type of sanctification he's describing here in Numbers and something that happens in the New Testament for a more spiritual purpose. And we'll talk a little bit about those examples then on Sunday.